The story begins deep within the neglected archives of a Charleston courthouse, where humidity, mold, and a century of decay have eaten through the past like slow fire. Amid the warped pages and water-stained ledgers lies a document that should never have existed, an 1847 birth certificate belonging to an enslaved woman named Celia. At first glance, it seems ordinary, a date, a mother's name, the signature of the attending physician. But the notes written in the margins, clinical observations scrawled in a careful medical hand, contradict everything known about human gestation. The measurements do not align, the timing is impossible. The physician's own words state plainly that the pregnancy they observed defied the laws of biology, not just of the 19th century, but of any era. Realizing what they had documented, members of the Charleston Medical Society quickly sealed their findings in 1849. The case was never published. 3 physicians fled the state within 18 months, abandoning thriving careers, each carrying the burden of a truth that terrified them into silence. Their descendants, generation after generation, refused to speak of what their forefathers witnessed. When pressed, they offered only one warning: leave Celia's story alone. Tonight, after nearly 2 centuries buried in dust and secrecy, we turn to the documented facts. Not folklore, not superstition, but medical records, journals, and plantation accounts written by men trained in science. Not storytelling, and yet what they wrote reads like something that should be impossible. Before we move deeper into this disturbing tale, take a moment and consider how far the reach of forgotten American mysteries can extend. Comment what state or city you're watching from, because stories like this, stories that tried to erase themselves, rarely see the light of day. What made Celia's case profoundly unsettling wasn't rumor or imagination. It was what trained professionals observed with their own eyes, with instruments and measurements and clinical detachment. In the 1840s, Charleston was a city of brutal contradictions. Grand manor houses built from the labor of enslaved people, refined society perched upon unimaginable cruelty. Cotton, rice, indigo, and human suffering flowed through its streets. Within this world, the medical community held unusual prestige. Physicians wrote scholarly papers on childbirth, diseases, and supposed physiological differences between enslaved and white populations. Studies conducted without consent, often through horrific means. Scientific ambition thrived alongside moral rot. Just outside the city, 12 miles northwest, lay the Hartwell Plantation. It stretched across 300 acres and relied on the forced labor of 42 enslaved people. Its owner, Edmund Hartwell, had inherited the property in 1839. His wife, Margaret, died in childbirth 3 years later, leaving him colder, more withdrawn, and increasingly bitter. The day-to-day brutality was carried out by his overseer, Thomas Gaines, a man whose reputation for cruelty was known far beyond the borders of the plantation. Celia herself had been born on that land in 1826. At about 20 years old, she worked mostly inside the Hartwell home, cooking and cleaning quietly, slipping through her duties almost unseen. Plantation ledgers described her with the usual sterile language: satisfactory behavior, diligent work, phrases that revealed nothing about her as a person, only her productivity as property. Her community included Samuel, a skilled blacksmith purchased from Savannah, and old Ruth, a 60-year-old midwife who had delivered more than 100 babies and carried in her memory generations of knowledge born of pain, necessity, and survival. The quarters were small, cramped cabins clustered behind the main house. Life moved through predictable cycles: planting, harvesting, punishment, endurance. Nothing unusual disturbed the winter of 1846. Celia showed no signs of illness, no changes in appetite or behavior. According to old Ruth, she did not gain weight, did not experience morning sickness, did not show the faintest symptom of pregnancy. Yet by the spring of 1847, everything would change. On the morning of March 18th, Celia collapsed while carrying firewood into the main house. What followed would mark the beginning of a mystery the medical establishment refused to face, a chain of events so disturbing that every witness, white and enslaved alike, recognized something was deeply, dangerously wrong. Celia's collapse on that March morning turned the quiet routine of Hartwell Plantation into a scene of rising confusion and dread as old Ruth knelt beside her, feeling the rigid tension in the young woman's abdomen and watching her shallow, strained breathing with a fear she could not hide. Whatever she sensed in that moment was so deeply wrong that she refused, for the first time in her long life as a midwife, to lay a hand on the patient, insisting with uncharacteristic urgency that Edmund send for a white physician because, as she whispered to the other enslaved women, "This ain't natural, this ain't right," prompting Edmund, annoyed by the disruption but unwilling to risk losing valuable property, to summon Dr. Saunders from Charleston, who arrived hours later expecting a common ailment, but instead found Celia's stomach grotesquely distended, firm, and visibly shifting with the unmistakable movements of a near-term fetus, despite the fact that every person on the plantation, from Hartwell himself to old Ruth, swore she had shown none of the gradual changes that accompany pregnancy, not in her gait, her appetite, her breasts, nor in the slow, steady expansion of her abdomen that even the least observant person would have noticed over 8 months, and the physician's notes, still preserved in Charleston archives, state that it was medically impossible for a woman to be this far along without showing any earlier signs, a conclusion confirmed when he brought in Dr. Pritchard and later Dr. Strickland, all three independently verifying that the child was healthy, active, and likely 7 to 8 months developed, even though Celia insisted she had been with no man, an assertion old Ruth supported with absolute certainty because nothing stayed secret in the cramped, overheard world of the quarters, and plantation records proved there had been no visitors, no transient laborers, no opportunity for hidden encounters, leaving the physicians circling an explanation that did not exist as they documented the disturbing acceleration in Celia's belly, which expanded by 4 full inches within 3 days, something no known pregnancy could do, prompting them to consider transporting her to Charleston, an idea Edmund refused because, as he reminded them, Celia was property, not a medical curiosity for public spectacle, forcing the doctors to remain on site until, on the night of March 23rd, Celia fell into a wrenching 14-hour labor, documented with meticulous detail by the physicians who seemed to realize even then that what they were witnessing would demand evidence, and when the child finally emerged, a fully developed 11-pound girl with the physical traits of a full-term infant, the doctors could not reconcile her state with their earlier measurements unless they accepted the unthinkable, that Celia had gone from showing no signs of pregnancy to delivering a full-term child in less than a week, an impossibility that left them stunned as Edmund, indifferent to their horror, named the child Dina and demanded Celia return to work when able, while the physicians gathered days later in Charleston to confront their notes, measurements, and the cold, irrefutable reality that something had taken place on that plantation which defied every principle of human biology, leading them to submit a sealed, conclusion-free report to the medical society, which agreed to preserve the documents but forbade publication, effectively burying the case from public view even as Celia's quiet, fearful demeanor and the uneasy whispers among the enslaved people marked the beginning of a much darker mystery still to unfold. In the weeks following the impossible birth, life on the Hartwell plantation seemed to settle into its familiar rhythm, but beneath the surface something had shifted, a tension that ran like an unseen current through the enslaved quarters as Dina, quiet, alert, unnervingly still for an infant, grew with a speed that unsettled even those who tried to ignore it, her body developing faster than any child old Ruth had ever seen in her 60 years of midwifery. And though Edmund remained uninterested beyond the financial value of a new enslaved child, and Celia carried out her duties with silent resignation, the enslaved workers began noticing things they could not explain, small details at first, like how Dina seemed to watch people with an intensity no newborn should possess, her gaze unblinking, following movements with precise, deliberate tracking, and how she rarely cried except at night when strange, twisted sounds carried from Celia's cabin low, wavering noises that made the women cross themselves in fear and whisper that the child was trying to mimic human cries but couldn't quite get them right. And when Samuel, the blacksmith who kept a secret journal in his workshop, wrote that the baby did not cry like other babies, but like something wearing a child's voice. The fear among the enslaved community deepened, made worse by Dina's rapid milestones, sitting without support at 6 months, pulling herself to her feet soon after, speaking clear, intelligible words by 8 months, real words, not the soft babbling infants normally make, and though Celia tended to her child with a mechanical thoroughness, feeding, changing, and bathing her exactly as required, she never held Dina longer than necessary, never sang to her like the other mothers did, never kissed her forehead or rocked her gently, acting instead like a woman performing a duty for something she feared rather than loved, and the other women felt that fear too, avoiding Dina whenever possible, their whispers filling the quarters late at night about the feeling that the child understood things no infant should understand, that her alertness felt closer to adult awareness than baby curiosity. And this unease became terror in February 1848, when a 15-year-old girl named Grace, tasked one morning with watching Dina, fled the cabin screaming, insisting the child had moved with a coordination far beyond her age, and then stared at her with eyes that held knowledge, eyes that felt ancient and deliberate, making Grace certain she had seen something that was pretending to be a baby, but was not truly one. And although Thomas Gaines dismissed the enslaved people's growing fear as ignorance, telling Edmund the workers were infected with superstition, the tension continued to rise, tightening around the plantation like a rope being pulled slowly, inch by inch, and Celia, silent, withdrawn, and increasingly hollow, seemed to sense it more keenly than anyone, moving through her days like a ghost bound to a living burden, one she neither understood nor could escape, while Dina continued to grow, faster and sharper and stranger with each passing month, her development too swift, her awareness too deep, her presence too heavy for a child not yet a year old, marking the beginning of a slow, dreadful realization among those who lived closest to her that Celia had brought something into the world that nature had not intended, something that watched, learned, and waited. As spring warmed the edges of 1848, the uneasy quiet that had settled over the Hartwell plantation began to crack when Dr. Pritchard, one of the physicians who had documented Dina's impossible birth, happened to encounter Celia and the child on a neighboring property, and though he approached merely out of professional curiosity, the moment he observed Dina, his curiosity hardened into alarm, for the child, barely more than a year old, moved with the balance and coordination of a toddler twice her age, her small feet steady on the dirt path, her eyes sharp and observant in a way no infant's eyes should be, and when she opened her mouth to speak, answering his gentle questions with clear, measured words, the doctor felt a chill he could not rationalize even as he forced himself to record her responses with scientific detachment, noting her cognition and body size as those of a 2-year-old, despite knowing with absolute certainty that she had been born just 13 months earlier. And when he returned to Charleston, he contacted Dr. Saunders and Dr. Strickland at once, urging them to conduct a comprehensive examination under Edmund Hartwell's permission, which Edmund granted readily, proud of what he saw as a valuable asset developing in his household. The physicians arrived on April 28th, their instruments and charts arranged neatly in the parlor where Dina stood waiting beside her mother, her posture too composed, her gaze too steady, her presence unsettling the men even before the examination began, for she watched them not as a child watches unfamiliar adults, but as an equal observes subjects, her focus sharp, unblinking, patient, as if assessing the physicians as much as they sought to assess her, and during the evaluation, she spoke in sentences that held structure, comprehension, and subtlety, language far too advanced for her age, responding to stimuli with reflexes almost too quick to measure, tracking movement with precise, predatory stillness, and when Dr. Strickland attempted to inspect her throat, she pulled away, not with the clumsy protest of a toddler, but with the coordinated strength of a much older child, looking directly at him and saying with perfect clarity, "No, that hurts." And although the statement itself wasn't extraordinary, the tone, calm, intelligent, and purposeful, left all three physicians shaken, and their unease deepened when, in an almost experimental manner, Dr. Pritchard asked her age, to which she replied after observing him for a long, unsettling moment, "I don't know. How old are you?" Demonstrating not only comprehension of the question but the calculated skill of reversing it in a way that forced the adult to confront his own discomfort. And when Edmund returned to collect Dina, amused by what he perceived as cleverness, the physicians could barely hide their dread, for they had seen enough to recognize that her development, both physical and cognitive, was accelerating in parallel, two separate trajectories rising at unnatural speed, pushing her beyond the boundaries of normal childhood in a way medical science could neither explain nor slow. After Edmund left with the child doctor, Strickland asked Celia privately what had happened during the months before Dina's birth, pleading with her to share anything she might have hidden, but Celia, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and trembling with fear she had carried alone for more than a year, whispered the same truth she always had, that she had been with no man, that the pregnancy had come suddenly, violently, like something growing inside her at an impossible pace, and that she felt no love for the child because the child was not hers, because something had used her body to enter this world, something wearing the shape of an infant but not born of her blood or her soul, and the men, though trained in rational thought, could not fully dismiss her words after witnessing Dina's uncanny awareness, nor could they ignore the heavy silence Celia carried, a silence born not of confusion but of certainty, as if she knew the child's nature better than anyone else and feared the end of something dreadful had not yet begun. After returning to Charleston, the physicians submitted another sealed report, one more detailed and more alarming than the first, warning that Dina's continued development posed unknown risks because her mind, far more than her body, was evolving at a speed completely beyond human norms, yet the medical society refused further involvement, forbidding them from conducting future examinations and instructing them to let the matter rest, unaware that on the Hartwell plantation, far from medical community's restraint and far from the controlled environment of their instruments and charts, Dina's awareness was only deepening, her intelligence sharpening each day, and the enslaved community, who saw her not through the lens of science but through the instinctive knowledge that grows in places of suffering, whispered that the child was learning not just how to speak or walk or think, but how to mimic humanity itself. As summer settled over the Hartwell plantation in 1848, the atmosphere among the enslaved workers thickened with a fear so constant and suffocating that daily tasks felt like walking through invisible smoke, a dread that clung to their bodies as surely as sweat, because Dina no longer simply an unusual child, but something growing sharper, stronger, and more aware with each passing week, moved through the quarters like a quiet storm no one dared acknowledge aloud, and though Edmund Hartwell remained blind to the danger, viewing her only as a remarkable investment that increased his property value, the enslaved people who lived near her, slept within earshot of her cabin, and saw her uncanny expressions in moments when she believed no one was looking, understood instinctively that something unnatural had taken root among them, and Samuel's journal entries from this time, written in careful secrecy, reveal how the subtle signs began to escalate, describing Dina's eyes following conversations with too much understanding, how she sometimes stood in doorways silently watching adults quarrel or whisper or pray, absorbing everything with unsettling stillness, and how she began speaking about things she should not logically know, thoughts or observations overheard when she was supposedly asleep, insights into people's emotions she could not possibly interpret at her age. And though Samuel tried to rationalize these incidents at first, writing that maybe she just smart, maybe too smart, old Ruth insisted there was nothing natural about her development, repeating that she had seen something similar long ago and that such a child don't grow into no good thing. And the others listened because Ruth had delivered more than 100 babies, had watched countless children grow and die, and when she said something was wrong, they believed her. By August, Dina, now roughly 17 months old but physically and mentally as advanced as any 3-year-old, had begun to display an awareness of plantation hierarchy, watching Edmund with a calculating stare and studying the overseer Thomas Gaines with a cold curiosity that unsettled even the hardened man, though he dismissed it as nonsense whenever the workers tried indirectly to warn him, laughing off their discomfort as foolish superstition. Yet he too grew uneasy when alone with the child, particularly after witnessing her stop mid-play one afternoon, turning her head toward him as if she felt his gaze, her expression far too composed, too knowing, and though he scolded himself for letting a mere toddler intimidate him, the unease lingered. The turning point arrived on a humid September evening when Gaines, drunk and furious after arguing with Edmund about plantation accounts, stormed into the kitchen where Celia was working late, and in his anger he grabbed her, striking her across the face with such force she fell to the floor, and before she could recover, Dina, small, barefoot and silent in the corner, rose and walked toward the overseer with deliberate steps, speaking in a cold, steady voice that froze every witness who later recounted the moment. "You should not have done that," she said, and although her words were simple, the tone was not that of a frightened child or an angry toddler, but something older and eerily controlled, something that spoke as if it understood consequences far beyond human instinct, and Gaines, though intoxicated, felt a sudden fear tighten his chest, causing him to mock her only to cover the unease prickling the back of his neck. But when Dina lifted her head and looked directly into his eyes, witnesses claimed something changed in her expression, something dark and ancient flickering beneath the surface like a shadow passing behind her pupils, causing Gaines to stumble backward and flee the kitchen, muttering curses to mask his shaken state. Yet whatever he felt in that moment would prove meaningless by dawn, because the next morning he was found dead in his cabin, lying stiff in his bed with an expression of terror frozen on his face, the muscles in his body locked in a way Dr. Saunders later described as extreme rigor mortis inconsistent with the brief time since death, his heart showing no disease or injury, as if it had simply stopped at once, abruptly, unnaturally, leaving no explanation but a silent room and a memory of a child's unblinking stare the night before. And while Edmund accepted the physician's verdict of unexplained natural causes, the enslaved community knew with a certainty that needed no proof that Gaines's death had not been natural at all, for they had seen the way Dina watched him, heard the icy tone of her warning, and understood in their bones that whatever Celia had birthed was no ordinary child, and that the overseer's fate was not a coincidence, but the first shadow of a danger that was still growing. After the death of Thomas Gaines, the Hartwell plantation entered a strange period of tense quiet, a hush that felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a storm, because while Edmund dismissed the overseer's sudden demise as an unfortunate but meaningless incident, the enslaved community understood with dreadful clarity that the danger had not ended with Gaines's last terrified breath, but was still walking among them in the small, fast-growing body of a child who did not behave like any child they had ever known, and Celia, hollowed by fear and exhaustion, drifted through her days with the expression of someone waiting for something inevitable and terrible, while Dina, now approaching 20 months old but developing with the speed and comprehension of a child twice her age, continued learning, observing, absorbing, always watching with that unsettling, measured stillness that made the workers avoid her even more fiercely than before, refusing to go near Celia's cabin, refusing to be alone with the child for even a moment. And though Samuel recorded in his journal that Fletcher, the new overseer, viewed the workers' fear with irritation and threatened them with whippings to stop their nonsense, even he seemed wary around Dina in private, glancing at her too often when she lingered behind doorways or appeared silently at the edges of rooms, as if testing how close she could come before drawing out a reaction. Meanwhile, the three physicians who had documented the impossible birth, Pritchard, Saunders, and Strickland, remained restless in Charleston, unable to forget what they had seen despite the medical society's order to cease further involvement. And when Pritchard ran into Edmund at a social gathering and asked casually about the child's development, Edmund spoke with pride about her intelligence and growth, unaware of the shadow his words carried, and agreed to another examination, prompting the doctors to visit the plantation again in November 1848, where they found Dina standing beside Edmund in the parlor, taller and heavier than any child her age should be. Her features sharper now, her movements more deliberate, her presence radiating an unsettling steadiness that made the experienced medical men pause before approaching her. And the examination that followed only deepened their alarm as she answered their questions with grammatical precision, engaged them in thoughtful conversation, and studied them with an analytical awareness far beyond her apparent years. Her eyes tracking every gesture, every hesitation, every flicker of unease. And at one point when Dr. Strickland asked how she was feeling, she responded with a question of her own. "Why do you ask? Do I appear unwell?" Spoken not with the innocence of a child, but with the confident inquiry of someone accustomed to observing others more than being observed. And when Pritchard gently asked if she remembered him, she stared at him for a long, heavy moment before answering, "Yes, you were curious before, you are still curious, but now you are frightened too." A statement so precisely accurate that all three physicians felt their stomachs tighten, and though Edmund laughed at what he called her cleverness, the doctors exchanged looks of deep concern, leaving the plantation with charts full of measurements and hearts full of dread. For Dina was no longer simply developing quickly, she was evolving into something that made rational explanation fall apart under its own weight. Upon returning to Charleston, they prepared a third sealed report for the medical society in which, for the first time, they openly acknowledged their fear, warning that Dina's cognitive growth posed unpredictable risks, and that her intelligence was progressing at a rate that might soon exceed the boundaries of known childhood development entirely. Yet the society rejected their report, sealed all previous documentation permanently, and forbade further monitoring, declaring the case too extraordinary, too dangerous, too destabilizing to be pursued, an order that left the three physicians helpless and haunted, forced to watch from afar as something impossible continued to grow unchecked on a plantation that neither understood its danger nor had the means to control it. And back at Hartwell, life resumed its uneasy rhythm. But beneath the surface, the enslaved workers felt the danger intensifying like heat under the floorboards, whispering among themselves that the child's mind was outpacing her body, that her awareness was deepening into something no human child should possess, and that whatever had arrived in Celia's womb was not finished becoming whatever it was meant to be. As the final weeks of 1848 slipped into the cold beginning of 1849, the atmosphere on the Hartwell plantation tightened like a rope drawn slowly but relentlessly around the throats of everyone who lived there, because the fear that had simmered quietly for months was no longer something whispered only at night or shared in secret glances. It had become a constant presence, a living thing that clung to the enslaved community with every sound Dina made, every shadow she passed through, every moment her too perceptive eyes fell on someone with that unreadable, calculating stillness. And Celia, exhausted, hollow, and carrying the weight of terror that no one else could fully comprehend, moved through her days with the look of a woman already halfway gone, performing her duties not out of obedience, but because she had nothing else left in her but the motions of survival. And Dina, now nearly 2 years old, but as tall, steady, and verbally sharp as a 4-year-old, had become something the enslaved workers could no longer pretend was merely a fast-developing child, for her presence unsettled them in ways they could not articulate, her silence somehow more threatening than her speech, her awareness so deep and constant that even hardened men like Samuel avoided her gaze, fearful that the child could read thoughts as easily as she observed gestures. And while the new overseer, William Fletcher, dismissed their terror as foolishness, whipping 2 men for refusing to watch the child, Even he began locking his cabin door at night after Dina started appearing unexpectedly in open thresholds, standing without sound, watching him with that same disquieting focus that made him feel like prey rather than authority. Meanwhile, Samuel's journal entries grew darker and more urgent, describing how the workers felt as though something terrible was approaching, something they could not name but sensed the way sailors sense a storm before the sky darkens. And old Ruth, who had been avoiding Dina since the child's birth, finally confided in Samuel the truth she had withheld for more than a year, telling him that when she was a girl on a sugar plantation far to the south, she had witnessed another child who grew too fast and knew too much, a child whose presence brought death in quiet, inexplicable ways, a child whose mother drowned it and herself in the river to stop whatever was coming, and she warned that Dina was the same, that nature occasionally birthed things that should never have been allowed to live, and that Celia, hollowed by fear, might eventually understand what the other woman had once understood, that the only way to stop what was growing was to end it before it matured into something unstoppable. All the while, Edmund remained oblivious, concerned only with plantation profit and bragging to acquaintances about his unnatural, but extraordinarily valuable little slave girl, proud of her intelligence and too self-absorbed to recognize the unease in the eyes of the people who lived closest to her. And as winter deepened, the tension built in ways that were subtle at first. Animals refusing to go near the cabin, children crying when Dina approached, tools found broken or misplaced with no explanation, lights blowing out in the quarters when she stood nearby, but soon grew clearer, like a pattern emerging from fog, and Celia, who barely slept anymore, often woke with Dina standing beside her bed, silently watching her in the dark, her face half lit by the dying fire's glow, her expression unreadable and cold, as if the child were studying the mother she did not quite belong to. By February, even Fletcher began avoiding her, muttering curses under his breath as he walked around her with wide steps. And when Dina started asking questions no child should ask about death, about fear, about how hearts stop, the workers began praying in secret, begging for deliverance from something they could neither fight nor flee. And Celia, empty-eyed, shaking, and carrying a secret she had never spoken aloud, seemed to understand that whatever Dina was becoming, whatever force had entered the world through her body, was no longer something she could protect others from simply by withdrawing. Something was escalating, reaching toward an outcome that felt inevitable, and the enslaved workers sensed it in their bones, in the cold that tightened their chests at night, in the dread that pooled in their stomachs. Whenever the child walked past with that measured, knowing silence, all of them aware that the story was building towards something catastrophic, something that would break open before the winter was over, though none of them yet knew that the end, violent, tragic, and horrifying, was already creeping toward them in the dark like a spark searching for dry wood. On the night of February 23rd, 1849, when winter clung to the plantation with a bitter stillness, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the inevitable end that everyone had sensed but no one dared name finally arrived, beginning with a single scream that tore through the enslaved quarters in the dead of night, a sound so raw and terrified that people flung themselves from their beds before they were fully awake, stumbling outside to see flames twisting violently out of Celia's cabin, spreading with a speed completely unnatural for a cold, damp night. And although Fletcher shouted orders and forced the men into a frantic bucket line, those closest to the blaze felt immediately that there was no saving whoever was inside, for the fire had already consumed the doorway in a roaring wall of heat, and Celia's figure, if still alive at all, could not possibly escape from behind the barricaded entrance that witnesses later described as being blocked from the inside, as if someone had pushed furniture against the door to prevent any chance of getting out. By the time the flames subsided and the charred remains of the cabin collapsed into smoldering embers, the plantation workers stood in silent clusters, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion, and Fletcher, trying to maintain order, ordered a search through the rubble, discovering two bodies intertwined near what had once been the center of the room, one small, one adult, burned beyond recognition, but unmistakably positioned like a mother holding her child. both motionless, as if they had not fought the flames at all, but had lain still and waiting. And when Dr. Saunders arrived at dawn to examine the remains, he noted signs that suggested neither had attempted to flee, that Celia had likely been lying down when the fire ignited, that the oil lamps found shattered around the room indicated deliberate placement of accelerants, and that the door had clearly been blocked from within, leading him to the quiet, careful conclusion that the fire had not been an accident, but an act of final, desperate intent. Yet none of this reached Edmund in a way that stirred true emotion, for he responded not with grief, but with rage at the loss of his valuable property. Demanding interrogations and punishment, though Fletcher's brutal questioning yielded nothing but frightened denials and trembling silence, for the enslaved people understood what Edmund did not, that Celia had not died in madness or confusion, but in clarity, in the grim acceptance that whatever she had brought into the world had grown beyond her ability to contain, and Samuel's journal, which survived long after the plantation itself vanished, captured the truth that none of them dared admit aloud to the overseers, that Celia had done what she believed was the only way to stop the thing growing in her child, that she had chosen death for herself and for Dina because she feared what the child would become if allowed to continue maturing. And though the enslaved workers grieved the horror of her final moments, they also felt the oppressive fear that had ruled their lives for nearly 2 years lift like a sudden wind clearing smoke from the air, leaving behind emptiness, sorrow, and a fragile, guilty sense of relief. Edmund accepted Fletcher's report of negligence and instability and moved on, more concerned with financial loss than with the monstrous implications of the case that had unfolded in his home, while the 3 physicians, Saunders, Pritchard, and Strickland, learned of the deaths through newspapers and gathered privately one last time to reflect on the events that had haunted them since that first impossible examination, each struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with the limits of their medical understanding. And though Pritchard suggested that perhaps the tragedy brought an end to a phenomenon that could not be allowed to continue, Strickland wondered aloud whether this might not be the only case in history, that perhaps such anomalies had happened before and would happen again, unrecorded or dismissed as superstition, questions none of them could answer before they each abandoned Charleston, one retiring early, one fleeing north, and one withdrawing entirely from medicine, carrying with them the silent weight of a truth they could never publish or defend. The sealed reports, locked away in the Charleston Medical Society archives, would remain hidden for more than a century, containing measurements, observations, and testimonies describing a pregnancy that grew to full term in less than a week, a child whose body and mind developed at twice the natural rate, and a mother who in the end chose fire over letting her child grow into something she believed was not human. And as time passed, the plantation fell into ruin, the land changed hands, and the cabin where Celia made her final, terrible decision disappeared beneath new soil and new structures, leaving behind no marker, no monument, no trace to show what had happened there except for the silent questions lingering in the forgotten documents. Was Dina truly a rare medical anomaly, a tragic case of mental acceleration, or had Celia seen something in her child that others refused to acknowledge, something ancient, dangerous, and utterly beyond human understanding? And did the fire end that danger, or simply bury it deeper, waiting for another time, another body, another story to bring it back into the world?